All right, here is Chapter 1, written in natural American English, first-person diary confession style, with a strong 30-second hook, around 750 words. Hook. 3 days ago, my son demanded I hand over every acre of my 1,450-acre farm and all 320 cattle. I said no. Tonight at the family dinner table, my daughter-in-law collapsed after eating the bowl of soup she had meant for me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Chapter 1. I never thought I would sit down to write these words. I never thought my life would twist into something that felt more like a crime story than a memory of my own family. Yet here I am, a 65-year-old woman with a farm built by calloused hands, forced to face the truth that the child I raised is no longer the boy I remember. 3 days before the dinner, I sat across from my son Jacob at the oak table in my kitchen. The same table where I had served him pancakes when he was small, the same table where his father once mapped out crop rotations with a pencil and lined notebook. Jacob had papers spread in front of me, maps, contracts, numbers. His voice was steady, but there was something sharp under it. He said I should sign over the farm, all of it, the 1,450 acres and the 320 head of cattle. I listened, hands folded in my lap, my eyes on his face instead of the numbers. He had his father's jaw, but none of his patience. When I told him no, the air in the room thickened. His wife Vanessa stood in the doorway, smiling in that hollow way she did when she was forcing herself to appear pleasant. Jacob leaned closer and his eyes hardened. He said it was time for me to stop clinging to the past, that the farm was too much for me, that I should think of his future. My future, apparently, did not matter anymore. I told him the land was not only dirt and fences, it was my husband's sweat, my own sleepless nights, the stories buried in every row we planted. I told him it was not for sale, not to him, not to anyone. He pressed his lips together, gathered his papers, and walked out. Vanessa touched his arm as they left, her smile flashing quick, like the glint of a knife. That night, I sat by the window and looked across the pastures. The cattle moved slowly under the fading sun, tails flicking, hooves crunching the dry earth. I thought of how many years I had stood watch there, how many storms I had braced against. The thought that my own son wanted to strip it away from me sent a chill down my spine, deeper than any winter wind. The following days felt strange. Jacob and Vanessa showed up more often than usual. They brought groceries, little gifts, tried to fill the house with chatter. To anyone else, it might have looked like kindness. To me, it felt like the careful steps of predators drawing closer. I caught fragments of whispers when they thought I was out of earshot. Words about opportunity, about timing, about what had to be done soon. I kept my fears to myself. I wrote them down instead, in this notebook, line by line. Writing made it real, but it also gave me strength. I reminded myself that the woman who had raised a child alone after her husband died, the woman who had managed every harvest, every birth of a calf, every storm that rolled across these plains, was not someone who bent easily. Still, something inside me broke. The moment Jacob looked me in the eye across that table, and saw not his mother, but an obstacle. I replayed his expression over and over, the set of his jaw, the flatness in his voice. I used to know every flicker of emotion in that face. Now I saw only calculation. On the third day, he invited me to what he called a family gathering. He said it with a smile that was too tight, his hand resting too firmly on my shoulder. Vanessa promised to cook, said it would be a special evening, that we could talk things over again. I nodded, but inside I felt the first stir of dread. Something about the way they moved in tandem, finishing each other's sentences, pretending to care. I knew a storm was coming. As I walked back into the farmhouse that evening, I paused at the door and breathed in the familiar scent of wood smoke and hay. I told myself to stay alert, to listen not only with my ears, but with my instincts. The same instincts that had carried me through years of hardship would have to carry me through whatever was about to unfold. I did not yet know that the soup waiting for me that night carried more than herbs. I did not yet know that I would leave the table alive only because of a single decision, quick as a heartbeat. But I felt it. Deep in my bones, I felt it. The morning after Jacob's visit, I walked the fence line as I always did. The air was cool, the ground damp from a light rain that had fallen overnight. The cattle moved slow and steady, their heads down in the grass. I felt calmer out there, away from the house, away from the echo of his voice. Out there, it was just me and the land, the same land I had tended for more than 40 years. I could still hear my husband's laugh in my memory when we first bought this place. He had said the soil was strong enough to carry us through anything, and it had. We built barns, dug wells, raised cattle and crops. We fought through lean years and we celebrated the good ones. After he passed, the farm became my anchor. It was not only property, it was my identity, the proof that I could hold a family together no matter what storms came. That is what made Jacob's demand cut so deep. He did not see the years of sacrifice carved into these fields. He saw dollar signs. And Vanessa, with her polite smile and polished nails, saw opportunity. I was not blind to it. Every time she looked at me, I felt as if she were measuring my worth, calculating what I was worth alive and what I was worth gone. I tried to push those thoughts aside as I cleaned the stalls that morning. Work had always been my way of keeping balance. But even then, the silence around me felt heavier. The birdsong seemed distant, the breeze harsher. It was as if the farm itself knew trouble was closing in. Later that day, I went into town for supplies. The clerk at the feed store greeted me by name, as he always did. People in this town still treated me with respect. They remembered the years I donated beef to the school fundraiser, the times I volunteered at the harvest fair. They knew me as the woman who kept the farm alive when most would have given up. That kind of respect cannot be bought, and it cannot be signed away on a piece of paper. I thought about that as I drove home with the truck bed full of feed. Respect is earned, but greed can erase it in a heartbeat. Jacob had not earned this land, yet he wanted to claim it as if it were his right. The more I thought about it, the more I understood how far he might go. That evening, as the sun set, I sat in the living room with the old photo albums. I looked at pictures of Jacob as a boy, running barefoot through the pasture, climbing onto his father's shoulders. I traced the edges of those photos with my fingers, trying to reconcile that child with the man who now stood against me. Somewhere along the line, something changed. I wondered if I had missed the signs. The sound of a car engine broke my thoughts. Headlights swept across the front yard. It was Jacob and Vanessa again. They came in carrying a casserole dish, their voices bright, almost too cheerful. "Mum, we thought we would drop this off for you," Vanessa said, setting it on the counter. "You should not be cooking so much on your own." I thanked her, though my stomach turned at the gesture. She moved around the kitchen with ease, like she already owned the place. Jacob leaned against the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. "We need to talk again soon," he said, his tone light but firm. "You know this farm is too much for you alone. It is time to think about the future." I met his gaze and answered evenly. "The future of this land is not yours to decide." The air between us froze. Vanessa cleared her throat and tried to soften the moment. She poured herself a glass of water, then sipped it slowly, her eyes darting between us. After they left, the house felt emptier than ever. I could not bring myself to touch the casserole. I wrapped it in foil and set it outside for the stray dogs that wandered near the barn. I told myself it was just caution, but deep down I knew I did not trust anything they brought into my kitchen. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. I wrote about the look in Jacob's eyes, the chill in Vanessa's smile. I wrote that I felt surrounded in my own home. I ended the entry with a promise to myself. I would protect this land, no matter what. As I laid down to sleep, the crickets sang outside the window. I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark. This is my land. My fight is only beginning. 2 days after they left the casserole, Jacob called and invited me to what he called a family dinner. His voice on the phone was steady, but there was something off, like a note out of tune in a familiar song. He said Vanessa wanted to cook something special, that it was time for us to sit together and put all the tension behind us. I agreed, but not out of trust. I agreed because I wanted to see what they were planning. That evening, the sky was painted in soft orange and purple as I drove the truck down the long dirt road to Jacob's house. Their place stood on the edge of the property line, a newer home with bright siding and wide windows that always seemed too polished for the dust of farm country. As I parked, I noticed their porch lights already glowing, a little too bright for such an early hour. When Vanessa opened the door, her smile was wide, rehearsed. The smell of garlic and herbs floated out, but behind it there was something else, a faint bitterness in the air that did not belong. Jacob came from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, acting the part of a welcoming host. "Mom, I am glad you came," he said, reaching for my coat. "Tonight will be good for all of us." I handed him the coat, but kept my eyes steady on his. "We will see." The dining table was set neatly with candles and fresh flowers. Vanessa moved quickly between the stove and the table, her movements sharp but graceful, as if she were playing a part on a stage. She placed a large pot in the center and began to ladle soup into bowls. "Special recipe," she said. "I wanted tonight to feel warm, like old times." I sat down slowly, watching her every move. The soup was thick, flecked with green leaves, steaming in the candlelight. For a moment I hesitated, listening to the silence in the room. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than usual. Jacob raised his glass. "To family, Chut," he said, his eyes fixed on me. "May we find a way forward." I lifted my glass, but did not drink. Instead, I studied the bowl in front of me. The scent was strong, earthy, but underneath it was a faint sweetness that reminded me of wilted flowers left too long in water. I had cooked with herbs my whole life, and I knew when something smelled wrong. I lowered my spoon back into the bowl and forced a smile. "Vanessa, it looks nice," I said, my voice calm. She smiled back, but her eyes flickered with something sharp, almost like a spark of fear. Jacob sipped his soup quickly, watching me out of the corner of his eye. He seemed restless, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. Vanessa kept glancing toward me, waiting, as though she needed to see me lift that spoon to my lips. I stirred the soup slowly, letting the steam rise. My instincts screamed at me. A voice inside whispered that this was not a meal, it was a test. I looked down at the bowl and then at Vanessa, who had just sat across from me. With one quiet motion, I slid my bowl a few inches forward and reached for hers. "Let me try from yours," I said lightly. "You always season it better." Her face froze for a split second before she forced another smile. "Of course, Mum." I pulled her bowl toward me and placed mine in front of her. The exchange was subtle, but in that silence it felt louder than thunder. Jacob's eyes widened for the briefest moment before he masked it with a laugh. We all began to eat. I took one careful sip from Vanessa's bowl, just enough to mask my suspicion. The flavor was bitter, almost metallic, nothing like food meant to comfort. My throat tightened, though not from the taste alone. I pushed the spoon down and folded my hands in my lap. Vanessa took her first spoonful from the bowl I had given her. She smiled, swallowed, then took another. The candles flickered, the air heavy with unspoken words. Jacob's gaze moved back and forth between us, his knuckles white around his glass. Minutes passed, long and slow. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I watched as Vanessa shifted in her seat, her hand brushing her stomach. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. She pressed her lips together, her face paling. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked quickly, his voice cracking. Vanessa nodded weakly, but her eyes told the truth. She tried to reach for her water, spilling half of it onto the table. Her breathing grew shallow. I sat back, silent, my mind racing. The bowl in front of me steamed softly, untouched. The bowl in front of her was nearly empty. The bitter sweetness lingered in the air. Jacob stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Vanessa!" His shout filled the house as she slumped sideways, her spoon clattering to the ground. I kept my hands folded tight, my face calm though inside my chest thundered. I knew in that moment what they had intended for me. The trap had closed, but not on the prey they expected. The candles flickered again, and the sound of Jacob's voice shook the walls. The dinner table, meant to be a place of family, had turned into the stage of betrayal, and I, the one they had planned to bury, was the only one still sitting upright in the glow of that false celebration. The house was quiet after the ambulance left. Jacob had followed them, his face twisted with panic, though I could not tell if it was for his wife or for the plan that had unraveled. I remained behind, alone at the table. The candles had burned low, their wax dripping onto the cloth, and the bowls still sat there, one nearly empty, the other untouched. My hands trembled as I gathered the dishes, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. I rinsed the bowls under cold water and stared at the swirl of broth circling the drain. I kept seeing Vanessa's pale face and the look in Jacob's eyes when she collapsed. It was not sorrow, not the grief of a husband. It was terror. He had not expected it to play out this way. The plan had turned on him, and in that twist, the truth had shown itself. That night, I did not sleep. Every creak of the floorboards made me tense. The old farmhouse, once my place of comfort, now felt like a stage where unseen actors moved in the dark. I thought about the whispers I had overheard, about the urgency in Jacob's words when he pushed me to sign the papers. I knew there was more beneath the surface, something driving him to desperation. The next morning I rose early and went out to the barn. The cattle stirred at the sound of the door, their breath steaming in the cool air. As I pitched hay into the troughs, I felt the rhythm of work calm me. But even there, surrounded by the life I had raised and tended, my mind would not quiet. I thought about what Jacob and Vanessa had risked. No one makes a choice that reckless without a reason pressing hard at their back. Later that day, Sheriff Hayes drove up the gravel drive. His truck crunched to a stop, and he climbed out, tipping his hat. He had heard about the ambulance call and came to check on me. We sat on the porch, the wooden boards warm beneath the sun, and I told him the truth of what I had seen. He listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the soup, the strange smell, the switch of bowls. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his arms. "Martha, if what you're saying is right, this wasn't an accident," he said. "This was planned. Folks don't just happen to serve up poison at supper." I nodded, my throat tight. I could smell it. I could feel it in my bones. They wanted me gone. He tapped his boot against the porch rail, thinking. I can't move on this without proof, not the kind that'll hold. But I can start asking questions. I can see who Jacob's been talking to, what kind of trouble he's in. I thanked him, though my heart sank. Proof. The word echoed in my head. It meant this was not over. It meant Jacob might try again. That evening, as the sun slid low, I walked the fields with a notebook in hand. I wrote down every detail I could remember. The smell of the soup, the flicker of fear in Vanessa's eyes, the way Jacob's hand shook when he raised his glass. I needed it recorded, not just for me, but for whoever might one day need to see the truth laid bare. When I returned to the house, I found the casserole dish Vanessa had brought days earlier still sitting outside by the barn. The foil had been torn back by dogs, and the food was scattered in the dirt. I stared at it for a long time. Had it been laced with the same bitterness? Had I been too cautious or not cautious enough? I would never know, but the thought made me shiver. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about Jacob as a child. I remembered the way he used to run to me with scraped knees, the way he begged for bedtime stories. I remembered the boy who had once told me he wanted to be a farmer like his father. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me as a barrier, a man willing to let his own wife fall to prove a point. The following day, Pastor Emily came by. Word had travelled through town that something strange had happened, and she wanted to see me. She brought a pie, her eyes soft with concern. We sat in the living room, and she prayed quietly before speaking. "Martha, I know this land means everything to you," she said gently. "But you cannot carry this alone. If Jacob is walking a dark path, it will only grow heavier if you keep silent." Her words cut deep. I had always kept family matters within these walls, never letting others see the cracks. But now those cracks had become chasms. "Emily," I said, my voice low, "he is my son. But I think he is willing to see me in the ground for the sake of money." Her eyes filled with sorrow. "Then you must be strong enough to protect yourself, and strong enough to let others stand with you." When she left, I walked through the farmhouse room by room. The photos on the walls showed decades of life, birthdays, weddings, seasons of harvest. I touched each frame, as if to remind myself of what was real. But behind each smile in those photos, I now saw shadows. That night the wind rattled the windows, and I wrote again in my notebook. "They will not stop. They have already shown me what they are capable of. I must be ready." The thought settled in my chest like a stone. Jacob was not done, and neither was I. The night of the family dinner stayed burned in my memory, but the days that followed pressed even heavier on my shoulders. Vanessa remained in the hospital, and Jacob came back to the farm more often than before. His visits were short, his words clipped, but the pressure in his presence grew stronger. It was as if he believed that with his wife out of the way, he had to move faster to finish what they had started. 3 nights after the dinner, he showed up unannounced. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my notebook open, writing down details before they faded, when his truck lights cut across the yard. He walked in without knocking, carrying a folder under his arm. His boots tracked dirt across the floor, but he did not seem to care. "Mum, we need to talk," he said, setting the folder down in front of me. "I cannot wait any more." I looked at the folder but did not open it. I told you before, Jacob. The answer is no. His jaw tightened. Open it. Just look at what I have drawn up. I pushed the folder back across the table. There is nothing you can show me that will change my mind. He leaned closer, his eyes sharp. You think you can keep this place forever? You are not strong enough. You will end up buried out there in those fields, and then what? The land will still come to me, but it will take longer and cost more. Why fight it? I kept my voice steady, though my stomach knotted. Because this farm is not just land and cattle. It is what your father and I built with our lives. It is what kept food on your plate and clothes on your back. I will not hand it over like it is nothing. His lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. So you would rather see me ruined? You would rather watch me drown in debt while you sit on all this land? I stared at him, the boy I once held in my arms, now standing before me as a stranger. I would rather see you learn that a man does not take what is not his. His face flushed with anger. He shoved the folder toward me again, the papers spilling out across the table. I glanced down and saw maps of the property, projected figures, even signatures that looked eerily like mine. My stomach dropped. You forged these, I said quietly. He did not answer. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair and paced the room. Vanessa was supposed to handle this differently, he muttered. She promised it would be smooth. Now she is lying in a hospital bed, and you are still standing here in my way. I rose slowly from my chair, my hands steady even though my heart pounded. You are talking like a man who has already chosen his path. But hear me, Jacob. If you keep down this road, there will be no coming back. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes cold. Maybe there is no coming back. Maybe you already forced that choice. He stormed out, leaving the papers scattered on the floor. I gathered them into a pile and locked them away in the old desk drawer. My hands shook as I turned the key. That night, the walls of the farmhouse felt closer than ever. The shadows stretched long, and every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. I tried to sleep, but the image of Jacob's face hovered in the dark. The way he had spoken about Vanessa, the way he had admitted she had promised it would be smooth, made my chest ache with dread. He had said too much without realizing it. The next day, Sheriff Hayes returned. He had questions, and I had answers. I showed him the forged papers, the maps, the signatures. He studied them carefully, his mouth set in a grim line. This is worse than I thought, he said. He is desperate, Martha. A man like that does not stop until something makes him stop. I nodded, the weight of those words pressing on me. Then I will have to be the one to stand in his way. Hayes put a hand on my shoulder. You are strong, but you should not face him alone. Let me do my job. I will keep digging. I will find out what debts he owes and who is pressing him. That will tell us how far he is willing to go. I thanked him, though I knew in my heart this fight was mine as much as it was his. That evening, Pastor Emily stopped by again. She found me in the barn, mending a broken latch on the stall door. She watched me for a while before speaking. You are carrying more than one person should, she said softly. I wiped my hands on my apron and met her eyes. It is my son, Emily. I cannot pretend I do not see what he has become. She stepped closer. Sometimes love means facing the hardest truth. Sometimes love means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. Her words lingered with me long after she left. I thought about Jacob's anger, his threats, the forged documents. I thought about the soup, the smell of bitter herbs, the moment Vanessa's body slumped in her chair. As I closed up the barn for the night, I knew the battle was not over. Jacob would come again. He would not let go. And I, no matter how much it tore at me, would have to be ready to meet him head on. The stars shone cold above the fields, and I whispered into the night, "If this is the fight I have been given, then I will see it through." The morning after Jacob stormed out, I walked the pasture before the sun had cleared the ridge. The cattle moved slowly through the mist, their dark shapes brushing against the tall grass. The land was steady, but inside I felt the weight of a storm gathering. My son had crossed a line, and I knew he was not finished. I returned to the house and found the kitchen table still holding his folder from the night before. I had locked most of the papers away, but the memory of his voice lingered. His anger, his threat, his admission that Vanessa was supposed to make things smooth. Those words clung to me like burrs, impossible to shake. Around noon, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Jacob's truck pulled up, dust swirling behind it. He stepped out with his shirt untucked, eyes shadowed, hair uncombed. He looked less like a man in control and more like one unraveling. He came inside without knocking, his boots heavy on the floor. "Mum, we are running out of time," he said, his voice raw. "I need you to understand that." I set my coffee cup down and faced him. "The only thing I understand is that you are making choices that cannot be undone." He slammed his hand against the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You think this is about choice? I do not have a choice. The people I owe are not patient. They are not kind. They want their money, and they do not care who gets crushed in the process." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice calm. "So you would crush your own mother to save yourself?" His eyes flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy he once was, the one who had cried when he scraped his knees. But then it vanished, replaced by the hard, cold stare of a man cornered. "If you would just sign the papers, it would all be over," he said. "I could pay them off, start fresh. We could all walk away from this." I shook my head. "No piece of paper will change the fact that you tried to poison me. No fresh start will come from betrayal." His shoulders stiffened. He looked around the kitchen, his jaw clenching. "You left me no choice," he muttered. "Vanessa told me you would be stubborn. She said you would fight to the end." I stood my ground. She was right. For a long moment we stared at each other, the air heavy with everything unsaid. Then he turned abruptly and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. I stood in the silence, my hands gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles ached. That night I could not sleep. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to move. Every sound of wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains tight, and still I felt exposed. I wrote in my notebook by lamplight, my words sharp and fast. I wrote that I no longer knew if I was living with fear or with resolve. The next day, Pastor Emily stopped by again. She found me on the porch, staring out across the fields. She sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap. "You look tired," she said gently. "I am tired," I admitted, "but I am not broken." She nodded. "I spoke with Sheriff Hayes. He is digging into Jacob's debts. It is bad, Martha. Worse than most folks realize. He owes money to men who do not forgive." I looked at the horizon, the sky pale and cloudless. "Then he has dragged us all into a pit I never chose." Emily touched my hand. "You cannot carry his sin as your own. He made his path. You must make yours." Her words gave me strength, but the fear still lingered. I knew Jacob's desperation would only grow. He had already shown me what he was capable of. The poison in the soup, the forged papers, the fury in his eyes. He was a man driven by fear and greed, and that made him dangerous. That evening, I took steps I never thought I would. I packed a small bag with essentials and hid it near the back door. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. I laid the shotgun across the table, the same one my husband once carried during coyote season. It was not in my nature to live this way, but I could not ignore the truth anymore. I sat in the living room, the lamplight flickering, and thought about the farm. Every corner of it held memories. Every acre carried the weight of years. To lose it to my son's greed would be worse than losing it to fire or drought. At least those were honest enemies. Late into the night, I heard a vehicle pass slow along the road. I held my breath until the sound faded. I wrote in my notebook again, my hand shaking. I am no longer safe in my own home. My son is not my son. He is something else now, something shaped by desperation. I closed the book and whispered into the stillness. If he comes again, I will not be caught unprepared. The house creaked in the dark, and the cattle lowed softly in the fields. My world had narrowed to survival. I had become a woman braced for the next strike, a mother standing in the path of her own child. 2 days passed after Jacob's last visit, and the silence felt heavier than any storm. I moved through the house with caution, listening for sounds that did not belong. The nights stretched long, and I sat awake with the lamp burning low, my notebook open in front of me. I kept writing, trying to hold on to reason when fear pressed too close. On the 3rd morning, Sheriff Hayes came back. His truck rattled up the drive, and I met him on the porch. His face was serious, the kind of serious that comes from holding back news a person does not want to share too quickly. He took off his hat, sat down across from me, and pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. I did some digging, he said, his voice steady. Your son is in deeper than we thought. Jacob owes close to $800,000, not to the bank. To men who do not forgive late payments. The words hit me harder than a fist. I felt the air leave my chest, and I gripped the arm of the chair to steady myself. Hayes watched me closely, giving me a moment before continuing. I also spoke with a man in town who saw Jacob meeting strangers behind the mill, men who do not belong here. They were not shaking hands like friends. They were arguing. One of them shoved him hard against a wall. I would say his time is running out. I closed my eyes, seeing Jacob's face the night of the dinner, the way his hands had trembled around his glass. Desperation had already carved itself into his bones. What do I do with this, Sheriff? I asked quietly. He leaned forward. You protect yourself, and you keep your eyes open. Desperate men make reckless choices. If he thinks you stand between him and survival, he will not hesitate again. When he left, I stayed on the porch, staring out across the pasture. The cattle grazed slow and calm, unaware of the storm circling. My son's debts were bigger than I imagined. His greed had dragged him into a pit, and now he thought the only rope out was tied to me. That afternoon, I forced myself to search the house. I began in the pantry, moving jars and cans aside, looking for anything that felt wrong. On the highest shelf, I found a small tin pushed back into the corner. At first glance, it looked like oregano, but when I twisted the lid off, the smell hit me sharp and bitter. Not oregano. I tipped a bit into my palm and saw the dried leaves, crushed fine. Foxglove. My stomach turned. I set the tin down and stepped back, pressing a hand to my mouth. I had tended gardens for decades. I knew foxglove for what it was, beautiful to look at, deadly to swallow. I carried the tin outside and waited until the sheriff returned the next morning. When I handed it to him, his jaw tightened. This is not cooking spice, he said. I know, I answered. They left it here, right under my roof. He placed the tin carefully in a bag and sealed it. This is proof. Maybe not enough for a courtroom yet, but enough to show intent. I nodded, though my body felt heavy. The house did not feel like home anymore. It felt like a place of shadows, a place where poison could be hidden behind the flour and sugar. Later that day, Pastor Emily came by. I showed her the empty space on the shelf where the tin had been. She pressed her lips together, her eyes filled with sorrow. Sometimes evil hides in plain sight, she said, and sometimes it takes the shape of those we love most. I turned away, my throat burning. I keep thinking about the boy he used to be, the one who brought me flowers from the pasture and left them in a jar on this very counter. How did that boy turn into a man who hides poison in my pantry? Emily placed a hand on my shoulder. The boy you loved is still a part of you, but the man he has become is his own doing. You cannot carry both. That night, I walked through the rooms again, touching each photograph on the walls. Jacob at his 5th birthday, grinning with cake smeared on his face. Jacob at 16, holding a calf with pride. Jacob at his wedding, standing tall beside Vanessa. The images blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I whispered to the silence, I do not know you anymore. Before bed, I checked the locks again, then wrote in my notebook. I wrote about the tin of foxglove, about Hayes's warning, about Emily's words. I wrote that I could feel the walls of this fight closing in. Jacob was not only my son now, he was a man in debt to dangerous people, a man who had already chosen betrayal once. As I closed the book, the night pressed heavy around me. The cattle lowed in the distance, their sound carrying through the open window. I sat in the stillness and felt the truth settle deep. The danger was no longer a shadow waiting on the edges. It was inside the house, inside the pantry, inside my own bloodline. The morning after the tin of foxglove was taken from my pantry, I knew hiding behind locked doors would not be enough. Fear had pressed on me for weeks, but fear alone would not keep me alive or protect the land. I needed to fight back, not just for myself, but for the farm, for the community that depended on it. I drove into town early, the roads quiet under the pale light. I stopped at the feed store and spoke with neighbors, letting the words slip from my mouth with care. I told them Jacob was trying to sell off the land, that he had meetings with outsiders who wanted to buy it up cheap. Their eyes widened, their voices lowered, but the news spread fast. In a town like ours, whispers traveled quicker than the river in spring. By noon, half the folks at the diner were already talking. I heard my own words repeated back to me as I sat with a cup of coffee. Jacob's fixing to sell his mama's place, one man muttered. Another shook his head and said, that land has kept this town alive for years. If it goes, we all lose. I let them talk. It was not lies. Jacob had shown me the contracts. He was ready to carve up the soil like it was nothing but numbers on a page. But now the community knew, and their outrage was louder than any sermon. That afternoon, Pastor Emily called for a gathering at the church. People filled the wooden pews, their voices echoing under the high ceiling. I stood at the front with her by my side, my hands trembling slightly, but my voice steady as I told them what I knew. I spoke of the debt, of the strangers, of the plans to sell. I did not speak of poison. That was my burden to carry for now. But I told them enough to let them feel the danger creeping close. When I finished, the room buzzed with anger. Farmers slammed their hats against their knees, wives whispered to one another. Even the young ones, who had only heard stories of the hard years, looked shaken. Emily raised her hands to quiet the crowd. This farm is not just Martha's, she said firmly. It is part of all of us. We cannot stand by and watch greed strip it away. We must stand together. Her words lit a fire. Men and women came to me afterward, offering help, offering watchful eyes. They promised they would not let the land be stolen in silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt the weight of community on my side. That evening, Jacob came storming into the yard. His face was flushed, his eyes wild. He knew. He had heard the whispers already. "You had no right," he shouted as he marched up the porch steps. "You told them lies about me." I stood tall, my voice calm. I told them the truth. The land does not just belong to you. It belongs to the history of this town. They deserve to know what you plan to do with it. He stepped closer, his breath hot with anger. "You turned them against me. Do you think that will stop me? Do you think their opinions mean anything compared to the men I owe?" "They mean more than you realize," I answered. "You will not find buyers here now, not with the whole town watching." His hands clenched at his sides. For a moment I thought he might strike me, but he pulled back, shaking his head. "You have made a mistake," he hissed. "You are not protecting the farm. You are digging your own grave." I held his stare, my voice low. Better an honest grave than a poisoned legacy. He turned on his heel and stalked back to his truck. Gravel flew as he sped away, the roar of the engine echoing across the fields. I stood on the porch, the evening light casting long shadows, and I felt my legs tremble under me. But I did not crumble. As night fell, I walked the fence line with a lantern. The cattle moved slow, their silhouettes dark against the starlit sky. The air was cool, the earth steady beneath my boots. I thought of the faces at the church, the voices that had risen in outrage. I thought of Emily's hand on my arm, steady and sure. For weeks I had carried this burden alone, but now it was shared. Jacob was not only fighting me anymore, he was fighting the whole community. That gave me strength. That gave me hope. Still, as I returned to the house and bolted the door, I could not ignore the chill in my chest. Jacob was cornered now, and a cornered man is dangerous. The foxglove in my pantry had been proof of that. If he failed once, he might try again. I sat at the kitchen table with the lantern flickering, my notebook open. I wrote that I had taken the first step toward fighting back. I wrote that the town was with me, but I also wrote that the danger was far from over. My hand shook slightly as I closed the book. Outside, the night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses close against the windows. I whispered into the stillness. "I am not alone anymore, but I know he is still out there, waiting." 2 days after the meeting at the church, Sheriff Hayes came back with a look on his face that told me he had something new. His truck crunched over the gravel, and he stepped onto the porch with a small envelope in his hand. He sat down across from me and placed it carefully on the table between us. "I went through Jacob's place," he said. "Vanessa is still in the hospital, and he has been staying away most nights. I had a reason to look. What I found is inside that envelope." My fingers shook slightly as I slid the flap open. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, lined and worn at the edges. I opened it slowly, and the sight made my stomach twist. It was a list, written in Jacob's handwriting. The words were neat, deliberate, as if he had taken his time. Foxglove leaves. Soup. Family dinner. Call doctor after 40 minutes. There were other notes beneath, scratched in the margins, amounts of money, rough calculations. But the first 3 lines burned into my mind. I set the paper down on the table, my breath caught in my throat. Hayes leaned forward, his voice low. "That is not an accident. That is a plan." I nodded slowly. He wrote it out like a shopping list, like it was nothing more than a chore to cross off. The porch was silent, except for the creak of the boards under our chairs. I could not tear my eyes from the words. The letters seemed to move on the page, each one cutting deeper. My son had not acted out of sudden anger or reckless impulse. He had thought it through, planned it, written it down. Hayes spoke again. With this, there is no doubt. He meant for you to be the one carried out of that dinner, not Vanessa. I felt a coldness spread through me. The hurt was heavier than the fear. I thought about the times I had packed lunches for him, the notes I had slipped into his school bag. Now I sat staring at a note he had written about my death. That night, I laid the paper on the kitchen table and sat with it for hours. I ran my hand over the lines, as if touching them might make them vanish. But they did not vanish. They stayed sharp, etched in ink and in my heart. I wrote in my notebook, my words spilling faster than my hand could keep up. I wrote about betrayal, about the sharp edge of realizing my son wanted me gone. I wrote that there is a difference between fear of death and the sorrow of knowing death was meant to come from your own child. Later, Pastor Emily came by with supper. She saw the paper on the table and picked it up, her face pale as she read. She pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes for a moment before speaking. "Martha, this is evil laid bare," she said. "You cannot carry this alone anymore." "I know," I whispered, "but it is heavier because it came from him. I would have carried any burden for Jacob. I never thought he would place one like this on me." She sat beside me, her hand over mine. "You must keep standing. The truth is your strength now." The next morning I went out to the barn. The cattle moved restlessly, as if they too sensed the unease in me. I walked the rows slowly, the list still in my pocket. I felt it like a weight pressing against my side. Every step reminded me of what had been written, of what had nearly happened at that table. By midday, the town already knew. Hayes had not shared the details, but word of a written plan spread like fire. People stopped me on the street, their voices full of sympathy, but also anger. "We will not let him get away with this," one farmer told me, his hands clenched. Another woman said, "He is not only trying to destroy you, he is trying to destroy all of us." Their outrage gave me strength, but it also deepened the sorrow. I had hoped to keep some part of this private, to hold the shame close and shield him from the eyes of the town. But now it was out, and the name Jacob was spoken in hushed, angry tones. That evening, I sat on the porch again. The list was still folded in my pocket. The sky was streaked with red and gold, the fields glowing in the fading light. I thought about how simple words on paper could carry so much power. 3 lines, short and sharp, and yet they changed everything. I whispered into the air, "You wrote this with your own hand, Jacob. You carved the truth with ink, and now the whole world will see it." The wind carried across the fields, rustling the grass. The sound was soft, almost like a voice. I closed my eyes and let the night settle around me. The fight was not finished, but now I had proof, and proof could not be erased. Inside, I placed the list into my notebook, pressed between the pages. It would stay there, locked in words, a mirror to his choices and a shield for mine. The list had already shown me the depth of Jacob's betrayal, but what came next cut even deeper. Sheriff Hayes came back one evening with something clenched in his hand. He walked into the kitchen with a grim expression and set a small flash drive on the table. "This came from a man who used to work with your son," he said. "He wanted to stay anonymous, but he thought you should hear it. I listened already. It is not easy." I stared at the flash drive for a long moment before nodding. Hayes plugged it into my old laptop, and the screen flickered as the recording began to play. At first, there was the faint sound of traffic in the background. Then Jacob's voice came clear, sharper than I had ever heard it. When she is gone, we can sell it all. The land, the cattle, everything. That is 4.7 million right there. We pay off the debt and walk away clean. My breath caught as I leaned closer. His tone was calm, certain, the voice of a man who had already settled the matter in his mind. Vanessa's voice followed, softer, coaxing. And if she resists too long, if she does not, go quietly? Jacob's reply came without hesitation. Then we do what we have to do. She will not fight forever. One way or another, the farm will be ours. The recording ended with silence, but the words kept echoing in the room. My chest felt hollow, as if the air had been sucked out. I had suspected, I had feared, but to hear it in his own voice, cold and steady, was a wound I could not ignore. Hayes closed the laptop and looked at me. Now you understand the full picture. He does not just want control. He has already counted your life in his profits. I pressed my hand against the table to steady myself. 4.7 million. That is all I am to him now. The sheriff did not argue. He left the flash drive with me, telling me to keep it safe. When he drove away, the house was too quiet. I sat with the recording replaying in my head, each word slicing into me. My son had spoken of my death as if it were part of a business deal, a line item in a ledger. That night I could not write in my notebook. My hands refused to hold the pen steady. Instead, I walked the house from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs. I told myself this home had value beyond numbers, that my life had meaning beyond a calculation. But Jacob's voice kept drowning those thoughts, steady and merciless. The next morning, Pastor Emily arrived. She found me sitting at the kitchen table, the laptop still open, the recording paused at the beginning. I played it for her without a word. She listened, her eyes closing as the voices played. When it ended, she stayed silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but heavy. There are some things a mother should never have to hear. But now you cannot pretend anymore. The truth is in his own words. I looked at her, my eyes burning. I carried him in my arms. I carried him through every hardship. And now he carries my death in his pocket like a solution to a debt. She reached across the table and took my hand. Evil wears many faces, but you, Martha, must not let his face take away your strength. You still have the truth, and you still have this community behind you. Her words helped, but the ache in my chest remained. I knew now that Jacob had already chosen his path. There was no confusion, no moment of weakness to explain it away. He had planned it, spoken it, embraced it. Later that day, I drove into town again. I needed to feel the eyes of my neighbors, to hear their voices. At the diner, the talk was already swirling. Someone had leaked parts of the recording. People spoke of it in low tones, shaking their heads, some with anger, some with disbelief. One farmer leaned over to me and said, "We all stand with you, Martha. No son who talks like that deserves to hold the keys to this land." I thanked him, though my throat was too tight to say much more. The weight of their support steadied me, but the shame of Jacob's voice spreading through town pressed hard on my shoulders. When I returned home, the sun was setting. The fields glowed gold in the fading light, the cattle moving slowly across the pasture. I stood at the fence and breathed deep, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I whispered into the wind, "You may count me in your numbers, Jacob, but I am still standing, and I will not fall the way you planned. Inside, I finally opened my notebook again. I wrote about the recording, about the sound of his voice. I wrote that betrayal is sharpest, not when it surprises, but when it confirms what you already feared. I wrote that no mother should ever hear her child speak her death as if it were a bargain to be struck. When I finished, I closed the notebook and set it beside the flash drive. Together they told the truth, clear and undeniable. The night settled quiet around me, but inside I felt the fire grow. He had counted me out already, but he was wrong. The fight was not over. It was only beginning. The night before the town meeting, I barely slept. The flash drive with Jacob's voice sat locked in my desk drawer, the list of foxglove notes pressed between the pages of my notebook. Proof had become my only shield. Proof, and the strength of the community that now stood with me. By morning, the church bell rang out across the valley, calling everyone to gather. The pews filled quickly, neighbours sitting shoulder to shoulder, faces stern and watchful. The air carried a charge, as if the whole town had come not only for worship, but for judgment. Pastor Emily stood near the altar, her presence steady. Sheriff Hayes sat near the front, his hat on his lap, eyes fixed forward. I walked down the aisle slowly, my hands shaking but my steps firm. Every face turned toward me. I could feel their sympathy, but also their expectation. They wanted the truth, and I had it. Jacob arrived late. He pushed through the doors with his head high, his jaw set, trying to look like a man in control. But his eyes gave him away. They darted across the room, restless and sharp. When he saw me standing at the front, his lips curled in a hard line. Emily raised her hand for quiet. "We are here today because something sacred has been broken," she said. "This land, this family, this town, they are bound together. When greed tries to tear that apart, we must face it in the open." Her words stilled the crowd. Hayes stood next, his voice low but firm. "We have evidence that Jacob planned harm against his own mother. Evidence he spoke of selling the farm, the cattle, the land, all for money that would never last. You all deserve to hear it." He plugged the flash drive into a speaker. Jacob's voice filled the church, cold and clear. "When she is gone, we can sell it all. 4.7 million. Pay the debt. Start clean." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. People shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing, heads shaking. I turned toward Jacob, my voice steady, though my heart hammered. "Do you remember, Jacob? When you were a boy, you begged me to tell you stories before bed. Do you remember how you used to hold my hand when storms shook the windows?" "I do. I carried those memories like treasures, and now I carry this. You spoke of my death as if it were business, as if I were nothing more than a figure in your accounts." The words hung in the air. Jacob's face flushed, his hands clenched. "You think you can turn them against me with a few words?" he snapped. "You think they understand what it is like to owe men who do not forgive?" A farmer stood from the pews, his voice sharp. "We all know what it means to struggle, but none of us would poison our own blood for money." Others murmured agreement, some shaking their heads in anger. Jacob looked around, his control slipping. "You do not understand," he said, louder now. "She left me no choice. She kept everything for herself. She chose the land over me." I stepped forward, my voice cutting through his. "I chose honesty over greed. I chose survival over betrayal. You were my son, but you became something else the moment you plotted against me." His eyes met mine, wild and defiant. "Without that farm, I am nothing," he said. "With that farm, you have already become nothing," I answered. Because you sold the one thing no money can buy. You sold your own soul. The crowd erupted, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Hayes moved to Jacob's side, his hand firm on his shoulder. "That is enough," he said. "You will answer for this." Jacob tried to pull away, but the strength drained from him. He looked around the room, the weight of the stairs pressing in. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with debts or strangers. It was the fear of being stripped bare before everyone he had once called his neighbours. Emily's voice rose over the noise. "This is a lesson for all of us. Greed can destroy families. It can poison love. But truth and community will always outlast the lies." The room quieted, the words settling deep. Hayes led Jacob down the aisle, his head bowed now, his steps uneven. People watched in silence, some with anger, some with sorrow. I stood at the front, my body trembling but my heart steady. I had faced my son and his betrayal in the open. I had laid bare the truth. The weight was heavy, but it was no longer mine alone to carry. As the church emptied, neighbours came to me, touching my arm, offering words of support. Emily stayed close, her hand warm on my shoulder. When the last of the crowd had gone, I sat in the quiet pews, staring at the altar. I whispered to myself, "The fight is not finished, but I am not afraid anymore." The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colours across the floor. For the first time in many weeks, I let myself breathe deep. The worst had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. The church meeting had left me shaken, but it had also given me strength. The truth was no longer buried in whispers or hidden notes. It had been spoken in Jacob's own voice, and the community had heard it. Still, the days that followed were not simple. The weight of betrayal does not vanish when evidence is laid bare. It lingers, heavy and painful, until time and grace begin to soften it. Jacob was taken into custody, but the charges would take time. Sheriff Hayes explained that there would be a process, that the courts would decide the punishment. The law would have its say, but what mattered to me was that the danger was finally contained. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking at every sound. I went about my chores with a steady rhythm, feeding cattle, mending fences, walking the pasture in the early light. The land felt different now, as if it had endured the storm with me and stood stronger for it. Neighbours came by often, offering help, bringing meals, making sure I was not alone. Their presence was a reminder that while I had lost much, I had not lost everything. One afternoon, Pastor Emily came to sit with me on the porch. We watched the cattle graze in the distance, the sun warm on our faces. She spoke gently. "You did what needed to be done, Martha. You spoke the truth, and you stood firm. But the hardest part may be what comes after." I nodded, living with what remains. "Yes," she said. "You cannot erase what Jacob tried to do, but you can choose what you carry from it. Hatred will weigh you down. Forgiveness will not excuse his actions, but it will set you free." Her words lingered. Forgiveness was not easy. My son had plotted against me, had nearly succeeded. Yet in the quiet moments, I still remembered the boy he had been. I remembered the laughter, the hugs, the way his small hand once fit in mine. Those memories had not been erased by his betrayal. They remained, fragile and distant, but still mine to hold. A week later, I received word that Vanessa had recovered enough to speak. She wanted to see me. At first I resisted, but something inside urged me to go. I drove to the hospital, my hands tight on the steering wheel, unsure of what I would say. Vanessa looked pale, her eyes hollow, but she met my gaze with something I had not seen before. Not arrogance, not coldness, but shame. "I know what I did," she said quietly. "I followed Jacob's lead, but I chose it too. I will carry that for the rest of my life. I do not ask for forgiveness, but I needed to tell you I am sorry." Her words did not erase the pain, but they broke something open inside me. I saw her not as a rival or an enemy, but as a woman who had been dragged into darkness and had stumbled there willingly. She was guilty, but she was also broken. I spoke softly. "What you tried to do cannot be undone, but I hope you find a way to build something better than the ruins you helped create." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. It was not reconciliation, but it was a beginning. When I left the hospital, the sky was wide and clear. The air smelled of rain on the horizon. I thought of Jacob, locked away, facing the weight of his choices. I thought of Vanessa, weak in a hospital bed, burdened by guilt. And I thought of myself, standing at the edge of the field, the wind in my hair, still alive, still holding on to the land that had carried me through. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew I would not let it define the rest of my life. Forgiveness would come in small steps, not as a gift to them, but as a release for me. Justice would come through the courts, but healing would come through time and through the love of those who had stood with me. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. The cattle grazed quietly, the earth steady beneath them. I opened my notebook and wrote the final entry of this chapter of my life. I survived not because I was stronger than betrayal, but because I refused to surrender to it. My son's choices have left scars, but they have also taught me the power of truth, of community, and of forgiveness. I cannot change what was done, but I can choose to keep living. I can choose to let hope guide me forward. As the last light faded, I closed the book and let the night settle around me. The storm had passed. The land endured. And so did I. Thank you for staying with me through this story. These words are not only about betrayal and pain, but about survival, justice, and the power of forgiveness. Life can break us, but it can also teach us where our strength truly lies. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us if you have faced struggles that tested your spirit, and how you found the courage to keep going. And if you believe in the strength of truth and hope, let your voice be heard.